recycling these things, putting new names on them. But again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record. Comes down to two things: data and process. That's what we used to be called, and that's what we need to concentrate on.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with practitioners, specifically around the topic of business process management, those that are putting it into practice day in and day out. I know that a common question I get from our viewers is, who's putting BPM into practice that's actually delivering real tangible value to their organization? And I think that's the most important thing. You know, we can read about it, we can hear about it, but who's actually, working on it day in and day out and actually facing those challenges, those obstacles, because they do come, and who's actually delivering real value to the company that they're working with or working for. And today's interview, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Sam Holcman. Now, Sam is an expert enterprise architect and business architect practitioner, and has been so for the last 50 years, and having engaged with more than 4,800 organizations globally. We're having a brief conversation before about all the many states of Australia that he's had the privilege of working in. So I'm very excited for this conversation. Sam, thanks for joining me.
Daniel, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the listening audience. This topic is very important. As Daniel mentioned, I've been at it for a couple of days, and hopefully I can add some interest to our audience on this particular very, very vital topic.
Now, I have to say that you're probably one of the guests with the most sort of experience that we've had on this series. I think one question the audience likes to find out is, where did you get your start? How did you start? How were you introduced to the world of business process management? Did you stumble into it, or was it something you were formally educated in?
Well, I began my career, I know I don't look like it, in 1972. That was a couple of days ago. And my background is engineering. And what I saw with engineering, I know this may sound kind of funny, is that in order to do something, you had to do something. And that phrase, do something, was you had to process things. Now, in engineering, you were doing, mechanical processes, electrical processes, and those types of things. And when I got involved in that particular area, I recognized that there were two very important things. Things that you use, stuff, parentheses, data, and what you do with those things, which is process them. So in my career, when I began in the 70s, to me, processing data or data processing was what we were doing. Now, to my chagrin a little bit right now, we've forgotten that, you know what we're doing today in 2022? We're processing data. So I never lost that focus with all of the internet chaos that we see out there and all of the silver bullets and magic that we see. It basically is fundamental. You've got two things the organization really has to concentrate on: the things of interest to the business, which is data, and how you use that data, which is the processes, and they should be given equal weight. We have seen, of course, in the industry, an incredible amount of resources being spent on the, quote, data side. Yet what we're seeing now in the 2022 plus era is an incredible amount of cyber issues, which we can net down to bad IT practices, parentheses, writing code, close parentheses, the way that we're mechanizing processes. So we're coming full circle. So Daniel, what we're trying to do, and hopefully what we're trying to do with this session we have here, is to get people to recognize we've got to come back to the fundamentals, data and process. So that's where it began in my world.
And why do you think organizations these days are forgetting the fundamentals or not valuing the fundamentals? Why do you think that
organizations are facing the challenges that they are facing?
I think that in the work that we've done, we see two fundamental issues. One is the concept of the silver bullet, trying to take the pain away. And so there's all these magical things that people are looking at. And the other thing, which I know will be a little surprising to people, is the actual desire on the part of a lot of technology people to actually complicate things. And we call it reveling in complexity, because what people feel is that with that complexity, I become the gatekeeper and therefore I'm becoming important. I look at it and saying that it's just the opposite. I also can become the target. In other words, that's there. So it's confirmation, complexity, reveling in complexity, and looking for the next magical thing out there that I think is the issue. In my early days of IT, I remember that the worst job, in quotes, that people had in organizations was maintenance programming. They always gave that to I'll use the phrase, the lowest performers. I looked at it and said, that's the hardest job. That's actually the hardest job, to try to sort through the nuances and the nonsense that's out there and figure out how to actually repair things. So again, I think it's just that desire for newness that is getting there. But I think that you and I and others need to recognize, if we look at the cyber attacks out there and the cost of that and do what we call root cause analysis, it comes back to business process management practices that are probably even not existent. They're not in existence there. People are not managing that part of the activities. Now, people tell me, well, it's infrastructure. Well, the hardware is the hardware. What's in the hardware? Software.
Right.
Which is processes. So you're back to that same fundamental, situation, as we, as we see it. We have all the world is going to face what I believe is another massive issue that will make the year 2000 issue look like child's play. Right. And that is year 2038. And 2038 sounds like a long time away. We're at 2022 right now. But fundamentally, we have a situation where the 32-bit operating systems, what is the operating system? Computer code processes will fail, just like we had the year 2000 issue. And we have to look at it and say, well, where are we going to find this stuff? So we have to remember, in year 2000, we were looking for a date, a piece of data. Now we're looking at how that is being processed, which is all of those routines that are out there that are using that. Business process management. I think we need to get started yesterday, Daniel. We should have had this interview yesterday, if I can use that phrase.
And what you mentioned there was, cybersecurity being a driver for an organization to adopt process management, or at least understand what's going on, because there's huge risks in not knowing what's going on. I mean, just before this, we started recording, you were talking about an incident that just happened today in America. That can be traced back to, I guess, a lack of understanding of the processes or lack of optimum processes. But would you say cybersecurity currently, right now, is the main driver for business process management, or are there other drivers that you've recognized?
The word that everybody is using out there, the newfangled word that's driving everybody in a certain direction, Daniel, is the word agility. Agility. We need to be more agile. Agile programming, agile enterprise architecture. The word agile. In the good old days, it used to be flexibility. Now we're using the word agility. All of those are cosmetology words. You put lipstick on a pig, you still have a pig. Underneath that are the processes that need to be optimized. So agile, the word agile, comes through building processes that are agilely built. So what we're looking for is the optimization of the processes to be able to meet the demand that organizations are looking for. And at the same time, using the word management, if we can manage that, we can then build an infrastructure that will hopefully start addressing some of this cyber stuff that's out there. So we have those two areas, but both of those are real sexy. Cyber security, cyber warfare, agile this and agile that. Business process management, not sexy, not sexy. Fundamental, right, but not sexy. So those are hopefully the things that we can latch on to be able to push the underneath. I don't care how agile you think you want to be or how cyber secure you want to be. You want to put 17 locks on your front door, bless your heart. It's not going to make any difference if somebody has the master key or somebody can get through the back door or through some other area. And of course, so that's what we need to look at. Not trying to sound gloom and doom at all, but I am trying to suggest that it's the fundamentals that we can trace back. Again, if we do what we call root cause analysis, not looking at the internet for magic, but root cause analysis, which is an engineering discipline, we can find out it comes back to poor process design or poor process management, or not knowing even where the processes are.
Yeah.
The organization. As I love to say, we need one version of the truth on data and one version of truth on every process that we're using in our organization.
It's amazing how many times I've heard people say, we're doing an agile thing, not a process thing. We're not doing process at the moment. We're doing agile.
And by the way, Daniel, we hear that all the time. And as a consultant, I have to just smile. I don't want to offend. Maybe I've offended everybody on this line. I don't know. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to say that, words have meaning. How do you become agile? Well, you have to engineer for agility. You have to engineer for flexibility. And so those terms are being substituted, I think, in a lot of organizations for the word, Daniel, quick. Quick. That's people are tired of the time, in quotes, that it takes for IT organizations to respond to the business. So we need to be more, quote, agile. But they're not doing the cause of what the reason for the lack of agility is, and that's the maturity of the software development practice. So there'll be other miracles. I can give you a list over the last 50 years of miracles that have been out there. I always talk to people about the new diagrams that are out there and use cases, business process modeling notation. You've got all of these diagramming techniques and all these tools that are out there. So I asked them, I said, well, how many people out there are doing Morne-Ayor diagrams? And they look at me and they say, what? I says, what about action diagrams? Well, what is that? How about protocycling? By the way, protocycling is what we now call agile programming.
Right.
How about cloud computing? We used to call it time sharing. Nobody wants to hear this. Again, we're recycling these things, putting new names on them. But again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record. Comes down to two things: data and process. That's what we used to be called, and that's what we need to concentrate on. So in order to become agile, what we need is an environment that is built for assembling things quickly. And that's not programming. That's actually a different maturity level. We call it maturity level 3. So lots of interesting things going on out there. You and I are talking about some fundamentals which will lead to an agile environment, I think, very nicely.
And so I think I think one question that I often get from various people that I network with is who's using business process management practically, and it is delivering significant value, because there's a lot to it. There's lots of different technologies. There's lots of different approaches. There's different methodologies. So who's putting it into practice and seeing it delivering significant value? I'm sure that over your 4,800 different client engagements, you've probably seen the bad ones and the good ones. So are you able to share with us some examples or case studies where an organization has adopted BPM and it has done wonders for their organization?
Well, it's funny. Nobody adopts BPM that we know. What they do is they find out they need it when we do something. So I don't want to sell BPM. I want to do something for an organization or with an organization. And then when they say, well, what was that? Then I say to them, oh, by the way, that's business process management. So I think one of the failures that we have here is we lead with a miracle. And BPM, some people love it, some people don't. They lead with an it rather than what we call demonstrating value, and then getting the organization to say, I need more of that. And we put a label on it, so to speak. So I want to give you an example of a finger pointing that turned into business process management. I think that in Australia, you have the same disease that we have here in the United States. It's called politicians. They all go to the same school. And one of the measurements here in the United States, which is kind of fascinating to me, is that Congress is measured by the number of laws that they pass. I look at it and say, that is the most ridiculous measure I've ever seen in my life. What I'd like to do is to not have any new laws. I'd like to have things that are effective, but that's okay. So it depends what you measure. Depends what what you measure. So if you look at that philosophy for just a moment, and you say, okay, how do we get past the cosmetics and the politics? So coming back to the politicians. In the United States Congress, one day everybody woke up and said, we're going to change the requirements for organizations to produce in the commercial sector their financial reports. So every quarter here in the United States, every 90 days or so, you have to report your financial situation that's there. And the Congress gave the companies 47 days to do that after the close. I have no idea how the 47 days came up in the first place. But, politicians need to change things. So one day they passed the law, they changed the law, and they say, we're going to go from 47 days to 29 days. Okay. Well, why don't you pick another number out of the year? You can't. It doesn't help to argue. They've got the power. The countries are run by the politicians, and so, you sort of say, okay. And by the way, it's probably not a bad thing, anyways. But so in this particular organization, the finger pointing came out, of course, and said the problem is the computer system. That's why we can't close the books any faster. It's the computer system. There we go. We happen to be consulting with this organization, and I asked what I thought was a very innocent question, which turned out to be less than comfortable. What's the financial close process? And everybody looked at me. Well, what do you mean? I said, I don't know how else to say it. What is the process of actually closing the books? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And everybody's looking at me. Well, it's in the computer system. I said, oh, that's terrific. I'm not joking about this. So you take a breath and you say, all right, why don't we figure out what that process is? So what we did was we went in and actually unraveled the computer system, dug out the processes, and laid it out on a piece of paper. Let me stress again, high technology on a piece of paper. It was a long piece of paper. And what we did was something that at that time was kind of unique. We laid out the processes in a timeline. And the size of the process action and the size of the time between processes. And all of a sudden, we saw that the issue was not the computer system. It wasn't even the processes. It was the time that these things were sitting in the organizational bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
So two things came out of this. What we call it is essentially process visualization and then process optimization. So first we visualize the process, then you can, using the term you used, manage it. If you can see it, you can manage it. You can manage it. So we laid this out, and all of a sudden we took the financial close process from 47 days to 28 days to 8 days without touching the computer system.
Wow.
Let me repeat again. Then we went in, Daniel, and said, can we optimize the process itself? So there's two actions going on. One is getting rid of the dead space, the dead time, and the other is then going on, to do that. Now, I need to give credit to Gary Rumbler and Gary Braish, who are the ones that, if I can use the phrase, actually invented the concept of essentially process flow diagrams. And they have a book called The Managing the White Space in the Organization. And what they did there was put together essentially the concepts that are very common out there called swim lanes. Swim lanes. So Gary Rumbler and Gary Braish in their book wrote this decades ago. What we added was the concept of that timeline to show where those dead spaces were, so that we concentrate on that first, and then we do the process optimization. Coming back to your question, I know it was a long-winded answer here, then you can manage it. So Daniel, in order to manage something, you got to see it. Final point. What you see needs to be human consumable, not IT compiler consumable for processes, but human consumable, which requires us in the field to study a little bit about human brains.
Right.
The soft side of it.
Yeah.
How do people actually see? How can they absorb these things? So it's an example, as I said, it's a real example of how we put all this stuff together. It's that visualization of the processes. Now, again, once you have that, as you're building out these essentially stores of processes, and we call them in our terminology, data distribution centers and process distribution centers. Now we take that from, everybody talks about data this and data that. We're just using the other side and saying we have to have the same thing. We have warehouses that store things, and we have distribution centers that actually use them. Warehouses are different than distribution. And so we use those same concepts of data on the process side to give them equal weight there. So, and it's almost actually kind of fun. It's almost actually because it's self-discovery. I also want to mention that the phrase that we use is that processes and data are the organizational DNA. And as you and I know about ourselves, your DNA is unique, my DNA is unique, an organizational's DNA is unique also. And capturing that through BPM is an extremely valuable asset that the organization will have.
Yeah. I think visualization is huge and something that a lot of organizations don't do or don't do enough of. I think the amount of insight that can be derived just from being able to see the process visually, literally, that was a perfect example or story or case study of where that was done. And I bet no one in that room was expecting the amount of value and insights then from what you actually ended up with, just by purely visualizing what was actually taking place.
Right. So for a major software company that all of us know, we did a similar thing for one of their major marketing activities. I have to be very careful here because it's very sensitive. And we did exactly what I just talked about. And the processes that we actually visualized was on 14, 4-foot by 8-foot charts. 14 of these charts. We laid them out in this room, and we try to get people to recognize you can't do this on a PC. It does not have the impact. And when the executives walked into the room and they said, "What is this?" We said, "This is the process for this XYZ thing." They looked and said, "Well, this is ridiculous." That's the impact.
Right.
That's the impact. This is what we're trying to get people to recognize. But if you show this on a 8.5 by 11 chart, or the phrase high level of detail, which doesn't make any sense to me at all. What does a high level of detail mean anyways? But if you show this on a PC screen or a 20-inch screen or 30, it's not the same. But if you walk people into this room and they see 3 walls filled with this, there is nobody in their right mind would say, "Yeah, that looks pretty good to me." Now you get them hooked, so to speak, and you say, "All right, now what do we do?" Well, I think we have to get a handle on this so that we can manage this to an optimized approach, ergo business process management.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all you got to do, and you don't have to work and think again in your life.
Now, you mentioned before about, I want to touch on the point of, I think it was a good segue there with the, executives walking into the room and visualizing this and seeing this. Obviously, executives in an organization, they have goals and objectives, and they're trying to meet the strategic objectives of the organization. How do you get buy-in? So we have listeners to this series, to this podcast, that they're working in large organizations where process management isn't valued or understood well. It's not understood on how it can actually support better decision making from the senior leaders. How do these people go about getting that buy-in or showing? I mean, you gave us an example before where you were saying you solve the problem, and then people will start asking, how'd you solve that problem? Well, this is actually the methodology or the approach we use. But for these people, how do you go about getting buy-in from senior leaders that just don't get it yet?
What we do is something similar, but instead of using a single dimension, we use a 2-dimensional grid. So if you can imagine for just one moment, you go to a specific, C-level person, whoever that is. You look at their goals and you actually write them down on one axis. On the other axis, you put the processes that it takes to achieve that specific goal. So you have a 2-dimensional grid. You have one grid that shows the goals the person or the organization is trying to achieve. And on the other axis, you have the process to actually make that happen. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if you have 147 processes required to achieve the goal, that's going to be difficult to achieve. So once again, that visualization. The key thing that we're trying to bring to your audience and our audience too is you need to recognize what human beings can comprehend. Mm-hmm. And human beings can only comprehend single dimension or 2-dimensional representations. I'm sorry for all these tools that are out there, but if you go back and look at the capabilities of a human being's mind, that's it. Mm. And so if you lay these things out graphically with not complex lines and arrows and all these other things, 2-dimensional grids, they can see this. And then once again, coming to your question, here's the goal that you're trying to achieve. Here's the processes that it takes to do this. And hopefully they say, well, that's not optimal. I mean, again, it's hard to hide. And I want to mention that when these visualizations are done, sometimes people don't like what they see because it's exposing the organizational, sometimes less than optimal approach. But if you can take a breath and say, this is not an indictment, this is the as-is state, what we now need to do is to get to a desired state. How do we take this and make it, more optimal? So what we tie back, Daniel, is we find the key indicator for that group. In the case of a C-level, it's usually goals. What are the goals they're trying to achieve? And we show them, we don't, again, talk about BPM or anything else like that. We say, here's the goals that you're trying to achieve, and here is how you're trying to do it. Now, what's even more telling is if we see all these gaps in understanding of how that goal is achieved. Can you imagine that for a moment? A few question marks. And in other words, we don't actually know. All we're doing here is not trying to indict, but to come up with what we refer to as a learning organization, coming back to human behavior again. It's a learning organization. Here's where we are. You may not like it, but here's where we are. Now, what are we going to do tomorrow? Make it better. Make it better. So what we're doing is trying to concentrate and on this. We have in our architecture practice, that's one of the key representations we put out there. And in some organizations, we walk in and we show a goal the organization is trying to achieve, and there's a blank line. People say, well, why is there a blank line? Well, we can't find any processes to achieve that goal. They say, what do you mean? It's on everybody's objectives. That's, again, the disconnect. That's the disconnect between these things. So again, we're going to visualize that and hopefully then back into, okay, this is called business process management. So we're not trying to get them to buy into it as a methodology or a discipline. We get them to recognize that's how they can achieve their goals better. That's what they care about. They don't care about BPM. They don't care about data management. They don't care about process management. They want to achieve their goals and get more money and all these other things, and put food on the table and roof over their heads. And obviously, I'm just joking a little bit, satisfy the customers and things. Yeah. So that's the objective. And you and I have to recognize that what we do is a pathway, but a lot of practitioners look at it as the end all. And I don't. I don't. I look at my objective is to help the business run better. Help the business run better. And that's how we visualize that and provide that insight. And then we put a label on it. We put a label on it. That's what we want to do. So even in my decks, when I present, I tend to start my presentations with the conclusions that the C-level person is looking for. And then I hope they ask, well, how did you get there? Let me explain this to you. And then I talk about, and then finally I put a name on it if you're interested in what that is, So I'm not trying to undersell what we're doing. I'm trying to position it so that we can keep doing it.
And I think having that correct perspective of what is the organization trying to achieve, I think that's so important, especially for practitioners or process practitioners that can sometimes get weighed down with all of the technicality of the approach that we apply. It's almost like, as you were talking, it's almost, I was thinking of, it's like a race car driver that needs the most optimum performing race car. They don't care. They're not so concerned about how the fuel makes its way to the engine, how the engine converts that to power, how the power converts that to the wheels, how they've got the steering column there. Their objectives is they want to win the race. That's their goal. They want to win the race. They want to be standing on that top podium at the end of the event. And it's they're not so concerned about it. Obviously, to win the race, the fuel does need to reach the engine. But there it's far more the highest goal of that I guess, analogy or that scenario there is to win the race. Not it's not a success that the fuel made it to the engine and that's it.
Right. Yeah, there is a term that is very common in the technology world that I know this sounds funny, have banned in our organization. And that word is the word user. This is a mindset that is underlying why most technology people don't have a seat at the big person's table. Mm-hmm. Why have we banned that term? With a little bit of humor, but a little bit of seriousness. The word user is only attached to two professions for the people that pay the bill. One is the illicit drug trade, and the other is IT. And the parallels are kind of scary. We get them hooked, and we charge them more and more for less product. It is the dependency mindset that we are not in charge. We are wait staff. We are cooks. We are chefs. Our role is to provide the best possible chocolate cake to our client. And they don't care about the methodology, the recipe, the ingredients. But if they like that chocolate cake, they're going to give you the ability to make more chocolate cakes. We in IT have to recognize that. And it starts with recognizing that you word is a mindset that's a dependency. It says, well, I don't really care. You're the user. And if you don't like it, it's too bad. And so it really starts with us. You know, mirrors are kind of bad things because it's reflective of how we act. And I have, as I said, when I say banned it, I really, in our organization, we do not use that. And I never push on my clients, stop using it. They just subtly, some of them say, well, why don't you talk about user experiences? I said, it's a customer experience, not a user experience. It's a customer experience that I'm looking for. That is not subtle. So again, coming back to, as you said, the race car driver wants to win the race. His team, his chefs and cooks and his mechanics and all these other people are supporting that, and everybody wins. But if he doesn't make it to the finish line as number one, I don't care what the recipe had, and I don't care how good the XYZ was. It didn't make any difference. And that's what we have to recognize as technology professionals. I think it has to do with maturity. I really do think, you know, IT is only about 50 or 60 years old. It's very young. You know, we've been building complex engineering products back to the pyramid days. You know, and, you know, somehow those pyramids in Egypt got built. I don't know if it was the Martians or somebody did a great job of figuring out how to do that stuff. But IT is very young. And in any young profession, you're looking for that quote, competitive advantage, not recognizing that we are a serving group. That's what we do. We serve the business community. Okay. That's why it's called business process management. You know, we've got to start with IT management, but that's another story for another day.
Yeah, another episode. And looking at the future now, looking at maybe the trends that you're noticing, and I know that, you know, a big part of our conversation has been around the fundamentals and understanding the fundamentals and getting them right. So I guess what is your piece of advice for those that are listening, that are practitioners in organizations, as they move to the future, specifically when it comes to business process management? Are there certain trends that you are noticing, whether good, whether bad? And what would you be encouraging them to start focusing on today if they haven't given that attention?
In order to get started, you need what I call a demonstration project. And a demonstration project is demystifying, Daniel, what you and I have been talking about for the last last hour or so. And so what I mean with that is that if you are in the process world and you're trying to do this, you have to demonstrate the something to your stakeholders, your clients, your customers, and build out that understanding. The term agility is something that I believe, Daniel, we have to latch onto. Agility is what we refer to as a maturity level 3 organization. Maturity level 1 is what's called make to order. If you are programming, you are in maturity level 1. The other term I use is handcrafting. I don't care if you're doing agilely or slowly. I don't care what the language is. And by the way, last count that we did, you have to take this for just a moment and breathe. 55 popular programming languages in organizations that we work with in the United States. That is lunacy. That is absolute lunacy. You see what people are concentrating on? The next silver bullet that's out there. Now, let me make a point here. How do you manage the processes that are built on that if you have 55 different fundamental things going on? By the way, those are the most popular. There's about 134 that we've come up with. The 55, I said, you've got to be kidding me. Remember the phrase Tower of Babel?
Yeah.
So we have that situation. So what we need to do is to, once again, take a breath and demonstrate the process, not how it's implemented. The language that we're using is the implementation. That's another set of chaos that I just mentioned. And show how we can, again, the key diagram that I would use if I was starting this is goal to process to whoever. It doesn't have to be C-level. And say, this is what's going on now. This is what we need to work on to optimize, to reduce that the process we need to achieve the goals. And that's where I would start, demonstrating those techniques, and then hopefully, getting someone to, if I can use the phrase, listen. And then comes the training and all the other things that are going on. And that demonstration shouldn't have to take very long to do. It can be something that somebody is attached to. Back a few years ago, when in the United States, we had President Obama, and he was pushing what was called the Affordable Care Act here in the United States, which is also called Obamacare. Make a long story short, this affected the whole insurance industry, medical community, infrastructure, hospital, just whatever. And if you followed any of the things going on in the United States at that time, it was John Roberts, who is the head essentially of the Supreme Court. He is the chief Supreme Court person, made a decision at 2:00 in the morning, as I like to joke, and because he was the tiebreaker, and said, "I don't care that President Obama doesn't want to hear that that it's a tax. It's a tax. I don't care. We're doing it anyways." So all of a sudden, it's a law. Okay. So what is affected by all of this? The processes. Well, you know what? There are some organizations out there that were prepared, as I call it, the next Monday morning, and they win because they had that business process management. So they were doing what we call event analysis that says, what if this happens? Or what if that happens? What's the effect of that on the way that we conduct businesses through our processes?
Right.
So once again, that's a different approach. What am I talking about here? Grabbing onto something that is I can use a hot button or a term, whatever term you're looking for, and building out the processes attached to that to show the optimization opportunities or possibly the chaos that's going on. So again, it's that demonstration, Daniel, that we're talking about. Final point here. You know what I look for? One convert. You know what I tell that one convert? Go get me another convert. So we don't have the ambition of saying we got to have the whole organization change overnight. We're more practical than that.
Yeah. That's great. I love that last point. Looking for converts, getting those internal champions that's going to walk alongside you and continue to foster and cultivate that approach. I think that's great. Obviously, in 45 minutes, Sam, we can only touch on very, very few topics, and I feel like there's so much more that I can just picture our audiences on the edge of their seat wanting more. So where do they go to connect with you, to ask you further questions? Are you open to that? Do you have a blog or a website where they can continue to glean more from yourself and the work that you do?
It would be my pleasure to talk to anybody, work with anybody, and possibly even make some money with anybody, in that order. So we love to talk to people, just like we're doing now, to get people to recognize what is going on. We have 3, unfortunately, if I can use that phrase, primary websites, and it's the 3 different practices that we do. I want to mention that process is underneath all of them. We have a class, by the way, called Process Visualization, Unlocking the Hidden Assets in Your Organization, as an example. Right. So on the enterprise architecture side, which I mentioned, one component is process. And by the way, that is day 2 of what we teach in our in our enterprise architecture, business architecture class. It's www.eacoe.org, Enterprise Architecture Center of Excellence, eacoe.org. Our sister organization is www.bacoe.org, Business Architecture Center of Excellence. And then soft skills, something that we think is massively important to technology people. Softskillsforarchitects.com is that you can see all of that. So the easiest one is eacoe.org, eacoe.org, or bacoe.org, and that'll link you up to all of those. And there you'll find probably 200 to 250 articles, web blogs, webinars, et cetera, and a direct link to me. And you can schedule an appointment, and I'd be more than happy to speak with you and talk with you or email with you on any of these topics. And if I have the opportunity, Daniel, to continue and talk about other things here, be more than happy to do that too. It's been a pleasure. Amazing. You can tell I have a little passion about this.
Absolutely. I think we definitely need to book in a few more episodes to start diving into these other topics. But Sam, it's been an absolute pleasure for me, and I'm sure the audience has gleaned a lot of value from today. I've been jotting down some notes there, and I think it's the stories you share. I think you said this before we even dived into the interview. It's the stories and the real life examples of people that are putting it into practice. That's what carries the weight. That's where the real value is being able to learn from someone that's been there and done that, not just learn from someone who's thought about it or wrote about it or in theory, and so I think I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience has. So thanks so much for jumping on the call today.
Daniel, my pleasure. And to your audience, go to business process management, figure out what it is. Thanks again.